Greetings, fellow Who-gazers, and welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the new podcast taking you through the world of the Target novelizations in publication order. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. Today, we reach the third year of the Target books. The Target Doctor Who range opened in 1973 with the re-release of the three Frederick Muller novelizations from the 1960s, the books we talked about on episodes 1, 2, and 3 of this program. In 1974, Target released 7 original Doctor Who novelizations for the first time, 6 Third Doctor novelizations, and a second Doctor novelization, Doctor Who and the Abominable Snowman, as John Blum and I talked about last week in episode 10. Up today is Doctor Who and the Curse of Peladon by Brian Hayles. The book bears a copyright date of 1974, but it was released in January 1975, therefore the first book of Target's third year of Doctor Who releases. But first, stand by for news! There's a lot that's happened in the world of Doctor Who this week, as I sit here and talk to you in mid-January, the week of the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday here in the United States. We got word that several new Target novelizations are coming later this year. Adaptations of 3 or 4, depending on how you count, new series adventures, and adaptations of 2 classic series adventures. We're getting The Eaters of Light by Rona Munro. Rona was the first person to write for both the classic series and the new series in terms of TV scripts. She wrote Survival, the last televised episode in 1989, and also wrote the novelization of that a year or two later, which we will address much further down the line in the life of this podcast. And then she came back to write The Eaters of Light in 2017. If you've been following my writing on Twitter or elsewhere, you know that Survival is just about my least favorite story of the classic series. I find it nasty and cynical and a bit intolerable, and the novelization leans into that by including even more death and depressing stuff that was cut for television. That being said, Eaters of Light I enjoyed much more. It's very different in tone and outlook. Of course, it's written almost 30 years later, and Rona Munro's writing style in the Survival book itself was excellent, even though I wasn't crazy about the content, so I'm quite looking forward to that. We're also going to be getting an adaptation of The Fires of Pompeii by James Moran. I'm pronouncing that the American way. I hope I got that right. Fires of Pompeii is interesting. It's the second televised story of Series 4 of the new series, and it features David Tennant and Catherine Tate. But it also features Peter Capaldi and Karen Gillan. Peter Capaldi, of course, is not playing the Doctor, but during the Moffat years, the Moffat scripts lean into the fact that this particular character imprints itself upon the Doctor, and the Doctor, when he regenerates into Peter Capaldi, chooses this character's face, which was not a courtesy ever granted to Colin Baker in the classic series in terms of Maxwell the Guard in Arc of Infinity, his pre-Doctor role. Karen Gillan, the future Amy Pond, also has a small but visible part in Fires of Pompeii. I'm curious to see if the book is going to highlight this and talk about the fact that 2 of the characters in the book would later become long-running series regulars. We're also getting, I understand, a novelization of the Zygon Invasion / the Zygon Inversion, a very well-remembered 2-part story from Peter Capaldi's run, written, I believe, by Peter Harness. So we are getting 2 Peter Capaldi novelizations, although it's 3 separate stories, with the Zygon Invasion and Zygon Inversion having been a 2-parter condensed into one book, and we're getting 1 David Tennant. We are not getting, to my understanding, a Christopher Eccleston story or a Matt Smith story this time around. However, we are getting 2 Tom Baker stories, and that's going to be interesting because all the Tom Baker stories have already been novelized, with the recent release of the last of the Douglas Adams stories, The Pirate Planet, having just been released as a Target, coming out in the summer of 2021. So what's going to happen is that David Fisher, who wrote several stories in the middle of Tom Baker's run, primarily for the Graham Williams era, had written audio-only novelizations for his two first stories, the two key-to-time stories, The Stones of Blood and The Androids of Tara. Terrence Dicks had written the main novelizations for those in 1980, and we'll be getting to those in turn on this program. David Fisher, so the story goes, was not happy with Terrence Dicks' work, which was, as Terrence Dicks was doing at the time, rather short books, about 100 pages, very entertaining, but not a whole lot of meat. David Fisher went back and wrote the stories in his own style. And if you've read his novelizations of The Creature from the Pit and The Leisure Hive, again, I'm defaulting to the American pronunciation, my apologies, he's going to, or he already has written, I should say, the novelizations of Stones of Blood and Androids of Tara in that style. I have listened to the Androids of Tara on audio. I have not heard his version of the Stones of Blood. It's much more satirical, if not an outright parody, in the way that it talks about the culture on the planet of Tara and yields some pretty outlandish stories about things that happened in that planet's past. But again, I've only listened to that as an audio release. It didn't have my full attention because I'm primarily driving or walking, and I often miss things here and there. I am very much looking forward to reading those in book format and seeing how they hold up. So we're getting several new Target books. I may address those when they come out, or I may wait much further down the life of this podcast when I reach the Terrence Dicks original novelizations of The Androids of Tara and The Stones of Blood. But of course, flip those books in reverse order as they came out. I will probably wait until the end when I reach publication order for all of the new series Target novelizations, but as the public demands it, maybe I will find a way to work those in sooner. Stay tuned. Page 2. Other news this week is that the latest Classic Series Blu-ray release is going to be Season 22, Colin Baker's first season. Again, as with Survival, I hate to turn the news portion of this podcast into this is what Jason hates this week's show. Season 22 is probably my least favorite series of the classic show. There are stories that I like better than others. I'm not excited so much about the stories themselves. What I'm excited about is the extra features and the Pete McTighe-produced trailer or mini-movie that accompanied the Season 22 announcement, as it has accompanied just about every other box set announcement, with old characters coming back to record new material in character, this time Perry. It looks as if we are getting a location featurette for Mark of the Rani. We are getting a new making of documentary for the two Doctors. It looks as if we are getting Matthew Sweet interviews with both Colin Baker and Michael Grade, who canceled/put the show on hiatus after Season 22, and a whole bunch of other excellent extras, and of course, In a Fix with Sontarans. So the trailer was a wonderful thing to watch. It's good to see Nicola Bryant in action again, playing a version of the character that is not being brutalized by the Season 22 Colin Baker Doctor. But we also have some interesting faces appearing on Behind the Sofa. I saw Wendy Padbury appearing with Sylvester McCoy. It looks as if Terry Malloy is back. It looks as if we're going to have 3 sets of participants in the Behind the Sofa feature. So again, very much looking forward to that release. Season 17 has not even come out in the US yet, so I'm not quite sure when we are getting Season 22, but that's something very much to look forward to. Page 3, lastly, in terms of news, as I record this, it is the 88th birthday of Tom Baker. We're still a couple of weeks away from reaching any Tom Baker novelizations here on the Doctor Who Literature podcast. We are still in the January 1975 book, which was released concurrent to Tom Baker's first TV story, Robot, coming out. I have incredible love for Tom Baker. He was my second Doctor. His material started airing on my local PBS station in February 1985, which was about approximately 2 months into my fandom. He was a tremendously influential character and actor for me when I was at the very impressionable age of not quite 11 and a half. I will tell those stories as the podcast reaches the corresponding books, but Tom Baker, 88 years young, happy birthday. Next up, the novelization Doctor Who and the Curse of Peladon by Brian Hayles. Let's get to it. Doctor Who and the Curse of Peladon, televised as The Curse of Peladon, written by Brian Hayles, from a teleplay by Brian Hayles, televised in January and February 1972, published in January 1975. Back cover blurb. Again, the terrifying cry rang out. The Doctor quickened his pace along the gloomy tunnels of the castle. Suddenly, from the darkness lumbered the mighty Agador, royal beast and protector of the kingdom of Peladon. The Doctor fumbled in his pocket. Would the device work? As he trained the spinning mirror on the eyes of Agador, the terrible claws came closer and closer. What is the secret behind the killings on the planet of Peladon? Is Agador seeking revenge because the king of Peladon wants his kingdom to become a member of the Galactic Federation? Will the Doctor escape the claws of Agador and discover the truth? And there you have a rare back cover blurb that includes a scene from the story itself. Just in time for the new year, 1975, the Ice Warriors joined the Daleks as Doctor Who's most memorable foes to enter the book line. Note the Ice Warriors received this honor before the Cybermen, whose first novelization would not come out until the next month. In retrospect, this is a curious choice, to the extent that it ever was a conscious choice by the people within Target rather than an accidental byproduct of a randomish production schedule. At the time, though, it made perfect sense. John Pertwee is said to have hated the Cybermen, whereas he faced off against the scaly green Martians twice during his 5 years in the role. So, for a book written at the end of Pertwee's tenure as the Doctor, and which came out only days after the premiere of his replacement's first story, it makes perfect sense to say goodbye to Pertwee as the reigning Doctor by introducing to the books a monster that he actually enjoyed battling. Something else interesting about the release of this novelization. By the time Doctor Who and the Curse of Peladon was published, all 4 Ice Warrior stories had already been broadcast on TV, and they wouldn't appear in another one for nearly 40 more years, discounting their appearance in the non-canonical Mission to Magnus, which we'll get to eventually here via the novelizations of the episodes from the Lost Season 23. What makes Curse of Peladon an unlikely bet as the first of those Ice Warrior adventures to be novelized is that it's the only story where they're the good guys. They're not introduced to the target range by way of the inaugural adventure, which is not too far behind this one on the release schedule, admittedly, but rather in the one book where they are not marauding villains. That's not to say that this is a dull adventure, featuring 140 pages of the Doctor and the Martians being terribly polite to one another, sitting on the porch, sipping lemonade, like that one Itchy and Scratchy episode, which was written by the cartoon's censors. You know which one I mean.
They share and love and share, love, share, the Itchy and Scratchy Show.
Lemonade? Please, I made it just for you. You are my best friend. This really hits the spot. Doesn't it, though? You make really good lemonade, Scratchy. Oh, thank you, Itchy.
Wasn't that funny, boys and girls? Well, wasn't it?
Instead, the Ice Warriors serve as decoy villains for most of the story, not being revealed as true good guys until the resolution of the Episode 3 cliffhanger. This gives author Hayles, here a first-time novelization writer, the chance to shroud his creations in pleasing ambiguity. They're introduced to the target line already as a known quantity, well-known bad guys, and Hayles, as he did in the TV scripts, is able to milk tension by having you wait for that eventual moment when they really will try to conquer and destroy everything in sight. For example, Sorg, the first of 2 Ice Warriors whom we meet on screen in the story, is introduced as follows. It was a biped, but totally unlike any other walking creature Joe had seen before. Its massive feet shuffled along as though dragged down by heavy weights. Its huge hands were like crude stub-fingered claps. It was entirely covered with an armored skin that was ridged and plated like an alligator or prehistoric reptile. Its helmet-like head showed a lipless, scaly-skinned lower jaw that seemed to struggle desperately to draw in air from the atmosphere about it. Set in the terrifying head were two blankly menacing eyes, screened as if by perspex. Moving relentlessly as a battle tank, it strode past them down the corridor and out of sight. Two things of note about this paragraph. One, it burdens every single noun with an adjective, and every single verb with an adverb. This perhaps gets to be a bit much, which we'll talk about later in the program. But second, as you read this, you think there's no possible way that anything good is ever going to come out of this creature. Not if it's crude, and armored, and terrifying, and relentless, and even worse, striding. Soon afterward, Islir, the Ice Lord, Sorg's superior officer, is introduced, and we're shown that he's quite a different breed of Martian, albeit no less menacing. Hayles writes, "Where Sorg was massive and brutal, Islir was sharply elegant. His helmet head revealed his rank. His speech and physical presence spoke without doubt of the martial tradition which had formed him. Although documented as officially representing the Galactic Federation as an agent for peace, every inch of him bore the hallmark of the warrior class. He spoke with icy precision." The Third Doctor's instinctive distrust of the Ice Warriors, which he came by honestly through the events of their two earlier villainous appearances during the Troughton years, is given an extended look in print. The novelization is probably based on Hayles' draft scripts rather than the televised version. The scenes in the book go on quite a bit longer and have a lot more dialogue than could have reasonably fit in 4 25-minute TV installments. We'll get to this bonus material later on, but for now, here's what Hayles has the Doctor say in print, that we didn't have time to get to on TV. "I know them, remember. I've seen what they're capable of doing. Not only are they technically highly advanced, but they're also a ruthless and warlike race. I'm afraid I don't trust them. And you're always telling me to look for the good qualities in alien life forms. The Ice Warriors are the exception to that rule, Joe. For me, at any rate. I'm telling you, I've met them twice so far, and they only have one aim: conquest." But, of course, as decoy villains, that means that Hayles gets to have lots of fun over the course of the first 3/4 of the story, heightening the seeming moral ambiguity of the Ice Warriors for as long as he can. The basic drive of the story: will the medieval planet Peladon, i.e. fading Empire England, be accepted for membership into the Galactic Federation, i.e. the Common Market? The Federation sends envoys from 4 highly developed planets, including Earth and Mars, to evaluate Peladon's request. One of those delegates resembles a throbbing phallus who had to be draped in a shower curtain after the first costume rehearsal revealed the prop's shortcomings. You can imagine how well that's going to work out. So when the Doctor saves the lives of the Ice Warriors and the other Federation delegates from a toppling statue at the Episode 1 cliffhanger, he's not quite sure if Islir's gratitude at being rescued is genuine. Hayles writes, "The Doctor, helping Jo to her feet, turned to find Islir standing over him, hand extended. 'You saved our lives, Doctor.' His harsh, hissing voice sounded genuinely grateful, but the Doctor could read nothing from his mask-like face. Later on, the Doctor finds himself, as you do, sentenced to death, this time by a regressive Peladonian theocrat. Jo is not quite sure if Islir actually wants to prevent the Doctor's planned execution. He writes, "Islir stood proudly forward. Jo held her breath. What would he say? With one word he could eliminate the Doctor as an enemy of his race, and yet remain outside the event as a guiltless bystander." Islir at one point also gives a dry, staccato cough, a sound that Jo later came to understand as the Martian equivalent of a laugh, end quote. But he's not quite as droll when discussing the Doctor's sentence of death with the other Federation delegates. Islir turned his mask-like face to her. It betrayed no emotion, but for some reason Jo felt that the Ice Warrior was undeniably pleased with himself. Interestingly, even after the delegate from Arcturus is outed as the real Federation villain, and after the full nature of the Ice Warrior's heroism is made clear in the final chapters, Hayles continues to write them as somewhat ambiguous figures, who could still turn on our heroes at any given moment. Islir rose to his feet. The impassiveness of his warrior mask, although showing no feelings, made him appear coldly threatening. The Ice Warriors were, in the classic series, and continue to be in the new series, through their most recent appearance in 2017, honor-bound warriors, who fall on the side of evil slightly more than they do on the side of good. Given their complex and not always evil nature, they have theoretically unlimited dramatic possibility. And indeed, the New Adventures novels of the early to mid-1990s featured them several times, including once as good guys in the 1994 book Legacy, the threequel to the Peladon saga. The Ice Warriors are monsters that work dramatically, and intellectually, and visually. They're a lot of fun, and never more so than in this, their debut novelization. After the break, there's a lot more going on in the Curse of Peladon novelization than just the Ice Warriors. There are more monsters than just the Ice Warriors. More scenes than you recall from the TV serial. More dialogue that didn't survive Terrence Dix's script editing. And descriptive words. Lots and lots and lots of descriptive words.
So, Arcturus was behind everything.
Arcturus and Hepesh.
But what about the attack on Arcturus?
Fate, Your Majesty. He told Hepesh what to do.
That is what I suspected.
And the things I found on the balcony and in Islia's room?
Planted by Hepesh. Or one of his agents.
And the manifestation of Agador?
And that's simple, Your Majesty. Hepesh found that on a high mountain a few still existed. So he captured one, trained it, and kept it hidden in the tunnels beneath the citadel. Ready to pop out whenever he needed a bit of haunting.
But why did he do all this? What did he hope to gain?
The entire planet of Peladon. Or effective control of it, which comes to the same thing.
And Arcturus?
His planet lacks mineral deposits. Peladon has them in abundance.
That's why he wanted to make sure that Peladon did not enter the Galactic Federation. You see, he'd already made a private secret alliance with Hepesh.
Extremely unethical. Fortunately, the scheme has been foiled, so all is well.
Ah, but is it?
Yes, Arcturus is dead.
But Hepesh is still very much alive. You see, Hepesh believed everything that Arcturus told him. He still does. He firmly believes that entering the Galactic Federation would mean slavery, and he'd go to any length to stop you joining.
But what can he do?
Accuse the Ice Warriors of murdering Arcturus?
Yes. Mars and the world of Arcturus are old enemies. That would mean war.
Exactly. And then all the rest of the Galactic Federation would take sides.
The Federation will be wrecked. There will be interplanetary conflict.
And Peladon would become the first battlefield. Blasted and sterile.
Doctor Who and the Curse of Peladon is Brian Hayles' first novelization. His writing style takes a little bit of getting used to, especially coming off a run of books dominated almost solely by Malcolm Hulke and Terrence Dicks. Curse of Peladon is good. It's an adaptation of a strong TV story, and it's very atmospheric. However, Hayles makes the thing perhaps too atmospheric. Just about every word needs a modifier, perhaps more than one. Chapters 1 and 2 both begin with a long, adjective-choked descriptive pan of the royal castle. Hayles writes, "The electric storm clawed and tore its way across the night sky like a wild animal, flaring suddenly into ripples of lightning more eerie and majestic than the 3 moons of Peladon. The harsh wind, drowned only by fitful claps of ragged thunder, howled and keened through the crags and passes of Mount Megeshra, while far below deep-shadowed valleys and canyons echoed and re-echoed to the almost continuous shudder of sound. Yet another blaze of light flowed across the torn sky, silhouetting the mountain peak. A mighty granite stone castle became starkly visible before slipping back into the darkness, its pointed turrets challenging the night. It was the citadel of Peladon." And Chapter 2 opens in similar fashion. "The fury of the storm was increasing. The ceaseless flow of lightning across the sky threw the rocks and crags of Mount Megeshra into savage relief against the wind-hounded shadows. Into that maelstrom of noise was pitched another, grinding, mechanical, unnatural, and a shape unlike anything that had ever been seen on the planet Peladon. Suddenly, solidifying out of thin air, a chunky, dignified blue box fell victim to the wind's claws." That's the TARDIS, if you need it. Not just a blue box, but a dignified blue box. And not just a dignified blue box, but also a chunky, dignified blue box. Later on, that same blue box is called Bizarre. Looks like somebody bought Brian Hayles a new thesaurus for Arbor Day. He even has trouble conveying a simple no. "Don't expect me to believe you, your majesty," Jo replied sarcastically, shaking her head in a firm negative when the young king indicated that she should be seated beside the throne. All that said, there's some good quiet prose tucked away among the operatic excess, not least of which when Jo likens Alpha Centauri to an operatic octopus. Of Hepesh, Peladon's sinister and conniving high priest, we learn that his dark eyes scarcely hid his quiet hatred. Torbus, the progressive but doomed chancellor, whose death is engineered by Hepesh in the opening scene, moves with the deliberate dignity of his ancient rank. I also like Hayles' introduction to the Doctor, a slightly jazzed-up version of the familiar Terrence Dicks riff. The hands that operated the controls belonged to a tall, slightly theatrical figure, his exuberant shock of white hair topping a lean but humorous face, which smiled with boyish pleasure. Oh, and the Doctor gets to rub his chin, too. Hayles also adds some depth to the Third Doctor's storehouse of Venusian karate moves. But when a huge fist gripped him by the shoulder and turned him from his path, he was instantly alert, hand raised to defend himself, with the famous Venusian Lochka, the straight-fingered jab of the carotid throat artery that could, if necessary, prove fatal. Jo's portrayal is a bit mixed. She causes a stir as she enters the castle throne room, because she looks exactly like King Peladon's earthling mother. Peladon, played on TV by Patrick Troughton's son, David, instantly falls in love with her, and soon proposes. That's not creepy at all, right? During Peladon's proposal, the book dialogue, which, as we talked about earlier, is way longer than the final TV cut, expressly has him tell Jo that he needs someone at my side with those same qualities that she had. Yeah. I prefer the following joke instead. It's an old Borscht Belt joke that you may have heard in the movie Dirty Dancing.
You know, I finally met a girl exactly like my mother. Dresses like her, acts like her. So I brought her home. My father doesn't like her. Go figure.
Hayles does give Jo some emotional depth. He writes, "It wasn't difficult for Jo to feel sympathy for the young king. In the past, she too had known what it was to be alone and friendless, and she could understand the hope in his face as he moved towards her and took her hand. However, when she's momentarily imprisoned by the Ice Warriors, she decides she must be in the middle of a bad dream and forcibly tries to wake herself up. She pinched herself," Hayles writes. "It hurt." Well, duh. This is also the same story where Jo is accidentally hypnotized by a spinning mirror. Oh, and in a scene that appears solely in the book, she loses a map that could have spared the Doctor from being sentenced to death. This is not, perhaps, Jo at her most competent. Hayles also expands the non-Martian Federation delegates. Alpha Centauri, one of the more memorable aspects of the TV production, is described by Hepesh as a, quote, wriggling squid. Centauri has 6 legs and hops about on 1 foot, which makes it not quite a hexapod at all. Or a hermaphrodite, in the book, Hayles consistently uses the gender pronoun he. On TV, Centauri was played by stuntman Stuart Fell, wearing a huge, veined green phallus, as we said earlier, cloaked in a shower curtain to describe its anatomical similarities, and voiced by Azan Churchman. In the book, Centauri changes color depending on his mood. Hayles must have been rooting around deep in his Crayola box. So many colors does he mention while typing. Uncharitably, Hayles describes Alpha's voice as trying to sound majestic and determined, but instead sounding more like a squeezy doll. Alpha was cute and cuddly on TV, and has become a fan favorite, coming back to the screen 2 years later in Monster of Peladon, and then again many, many decades after that in the 2017 episode The Empress of Mars. In the book, Alpha is more of a hindrance than a help. Hayles writes, "Alpha immediately raised several tentacles in protest. This was normal procedure on intergalactic civil service committees. A decision too quickly arrived at aroused suspicion. A certain degree of niggling was needed to give respectability to the motion under discussion. Where the Ice Warriors were decoy bad guys, Arcturus was a decoy good guy who turns out to have sided with Hepesh against the Federation, and who tries to kill the Doctor at the Episode 3 cliffhanger. In the book, we also learn that he's a bit, well, Dalek-y. The gravitation forces involved were in excess of humanoid resistance, he computed flatly. Serious damage would have resulted on impact. Your objective reaction is admirable, observed the Doctor dryly. But you might have been killed too, Arcturus. My sensor readings are not concerned with emotional response, commented the mechanical voice. Only deduction. Similarly, when Arcturus is seen eavesdropping on a private conversation, Hayles tells us that the information was fed into the microcomputerized decision-making center of the neuroplasm and was processed instantaneously and a plan formed. End quote. These details didn't have time to emerge in the TV version. One advantage to the book's length is that Hayles can add in a lot of scripted scenes that there just weren't time for on TV. In the Episode 1 material, we see how Hepesh tricks the king's champion, the hulking and mute bodyguard, Grun, into doing his dirty work. And we also get a scene in which Alpha Centauri and Arcturus argue about the niceties of Peladon's primitive culture. In the book, the Doctor explicitly says that Peladon is still a medieval society, slowly emerging into an industrial age. When he's under a death sentence, the Doctor reflects, quote, if the Pels were anything like Earthlings of the 15th century, they'd be certain to think up something clever and unpleasant. Towards the end of the Episode 3 material, Hayles adds 3 scenes that were presumably cut before taping. King Peladon starts to pray at a shrine to Agador, but suddenly grows a spine and threatens to abolish all worship of the beast if the Doctor dies. Joe attempts to persuade Grun to not kill the Doctor in combat by using her unit military experience. Hayles writes, Grun stood up, his mighty form rigidly at the attention. Joe tried to remember what the Brigadier or Mike would say to a lower rank. At ease, she said crisply, and Grun relaxed. When Joe looked at him again, she almost burst out laughing. His face expressed wonderment that such a slip of a girl should have the stuff of generals in her. Best of all, the Martian lieutenant, Sorg, helps the Doctor arm himself for combat, a nice one-on-one moment for the Doctor and one of his former enemies. There's even a relatively rare pop culture reference to the man who would be the reigning world heavyweight boxing champion by the time the book got released. Grun will kill you, replied the Martian fatefully. He's got to catch me first, retorted the Doctor. Float like the butterfly, sting like the bee, he quoted, with a wry smile and his own variation of the Ali Shuffle. So let's see what Grun will make of that. The Doctor's combat with Grun is a much more vivid affair, free from budget restraints. Hayles writes, the entrance was covered by a heavily spiked portcullis. The floor was of highly polished granite, so smooth that it reflected like a lake of still water. There were only 3 small areas in which direct combat could easily take place. All the rest of the ground space was filled with steps, mounds, steep slopes, and a jumbled medley of pillars and short columns of stone. On the walls, on the pillars, and scattered here and there about the pit, were a variety of weapons, a 4-edged axe, a sword with a broad blade that became a vicious prong, a lance with a barbed 3-forked head, and a triple ball and chain, hideously spiked. The Doctor's taming of Agador, alas, is less vivid than on TV. Here the Doctor merely croons a non-specific melody. The business of Pertwee singing a Venusian lullaby, to the tune of A Christmas Carol, was developed later in rehearsal. 2 other characters find depth in the book, King Peladon and his champion warrior, Grun. Peladon recalls what it was like growing up as a boy king, and the time his Earth mother urged him to show compassion in the face of the planet's harsh laws of justice. Hayles writes, it had been a trivial incident, a moment's misuse of power by a boy not yet able to understand that his words held life and death for his people. The word of command, and the servant would have been slain. But at his mother's quick intercession, he had held his hand, and decreed a far lesser punishment. Years later, that same servant had died valiantly defending his royal master against a ravening wolf, a life given up willingly to a purpose, not waste by a moment's thoughtless anger. Hayles was sure to tell us several times that Peladon grows up and earns the inherited mantle of king towards the end of the book, especially in the way that he rebukes Hepesh moments before the Doctor and Grun's combat, in another moment that was lost for TV. And at the end of the story, Hayles says, a youth had become a man. Perhaps a bit heavy-handed, but it's far from the book's least subtle moment. There's also a really strong bit at the end where the Doctor wins over Grun's loyalty and teaches him that there's a better way than to live Hepesh's bloody march to the ancient past. The Episode 4 material in the book adds a lot of context and explanation for what was mostly an anticlimactic episode on TV. You could argue that Hayles over-eggs the pudding by describing in gruesome detail what would happen if the Federation declared war on Peladon. The people of Peladon could be swept away utterly by a sickness of the bone or a plague to end all plagues. The planet would become first sterile, then a living tomb, then as cold and barren as the three moons that circle Peladon. In the end, Hepesh would have won nothing but death. This, of course, could not have been dramatized on TV, no matter how good a director Lenny Mayne was. The final chapter is a bit shorter than on TV. As written by Hayles, Peladon and Jo have no final scene together. Jo never gets to confess that she's not really a princess. The corresponding TV scene must have been written by Terrance Dicks, and its absence is felt here. Also missing is the Doctor's suspicion of Time Lord involvement in sending him to Peladon to begin with. That also must have been added by Terrance Dicks or Barry Letts. Which raises the question, just what is the Time Lord's interest in seeing Peladon join a Star Trek-style federation with Earth? And more importantly, if the story is an analogy for Britain joining the common market, how do you equate Britain, then still so recently the ruler of the biggest empire on Earth, with a tiny backwoods planet that had yet to discover electricity? Coming up, my interview with Ross from Gallifrey's Most Wanted. Ross has some excellent points to make about the prose style in this book and how it adapts better to the audio medium rather than the printed page. Very excited to have Ross as my guest, coming up right after the break. So I'm back now, and I'm delighted to be joined by Ross, a.k.a. Old Who, from Gallifrey's Most Wanted. Ross, very happy to have you on the program.
Thank you for having me. I always like coming on talking about different versions of Doctor Who.
I will say that I found out about you probably about a year ago because you had my friend Mark from the Trap One podcast, on which I am now a co-host, and you had him on Runcible Report along with Jeff, and you did a long, deep dive into the wilderness years. So that was how I discovered your show, and I've been a convert ever since. And my podcast backlog is now about 6 weeks, so I just got to your episode on the Vanquishers.
Oh, wow. Wow.
But I know you have 2 episodes coming up with Fraser and one with Cy, who were both just on the show within the last month. So we're all part of the same big, happy podcast family now.
That's cool. Yes, they were great. It was nice having them on. Jeff's busy. We all at right after before Eva the Dalek came in. Vic had stuff, Jeff had stuff, and I work in healthcare, and I had Omicron, so I didn't get time off during the holidays. So it was nice to have some guests. We always like to have guests. We're gonna have you on at some point. It's just I gotta get both my partners back on schedule. I'm the easy one. Well, I may be planning some little mini ones based on any subject I get in because I like to put an extra couple out during the month. On top of them, started a new podcast, but that's slow going because I do it solo, and that's very difficult to do, I found.
So you have 3 shows. You have Gallifrey's Most Wanted, where you and Vic, a.k.a. New Who, walk through selected episodes of the old and the new series.
We go each Doctor their first story, then their second story, and that way we got to touch on every Doctor in chronological order separately. So we're not getting it. God, I couldn't imagine. I don't know. I love all of Time and Space, but I can't imagine me just doing straight all the Hartnell in one stretch. So we had to jump around. So
I did that when I did my pilgrimage on Twitter. I started Hartnell October 26th, 2020, and I finished on New Year's Day. 2021. I love the Hartnell. I am an unreconstructed Hartnell fan. But I will say, talking about the original show that you and Vic do, I listened to your episode on Boomtown the day after I watched Boomtown, which came up in my pilgrimage about 2 weeks ago. It was one of the best episodes I've heard in the podcast format because you guys go deep into the 2 problematic male companions who are both now thankfully off the show. and you guys had a really interesting, fresh take on that.
Yeah, I was talking to Jeff about it, and it's like they don't taint it for me. I feel the pain of people they do taint it because I don't care. They're just actors. I like the characters, and that is I don't want that great episode to be spoiled by two people that don't know how to behave in a civilized fashion.
Right.
The character is what I'm there for. I find people go when the Doctor changes, it freaks you out, and he goes, no, the Doctor changes. It changes. I'm also a theater person. People go, why do we keep telling the same stories? Like in film, why do we keep repeating stories? It's like, because that's what we do. That's the way the art form works. You repeat it. You have reinterpret it. You do it over and over again. We've been doing it with plays for thousands of years. Movies are only about 110 years old, 115 years old. So yeah, but we've what is it? Cimarron's been 2-3 versions of it have been nominated for the Academy Award in one form or another. It's nature. So I get that was a really good conversation. Me and Vic just recorded one on Flatline. There's nothing political in Flatline. It was one of ours. It turned into a political diatribe for the second half. You'll enjoy it a great deal because I lose it.
I'm saving your episodes on The Lodger, and I'll save the one on Flatline until I get there in the pilgrimage. That'll be another 2 or 3 months, but I'm quite looking forward to that.
Yeah, we're about to go back to the beginning, so we're about to do Planet the Giants next.
Planet of Giants.
Yeah.
Are you going to watch the 3-episode version?
I need
or
to
find
find
where watching...
I've never seen the 4-episode, and I don't know where to find it. I've never heard of it.
It's the DVD. It's the original DVD, which came out probably in 2011.
Oh, in the beginnings?
They got Gary Russell.
Oh, no. Okay, then I may not have
Not the
seen...
beginnings, no.
No, I know which one you're talking.
Yeah. So Gary Russell did the animation. So it's half live, half animated. And they got guest actors to come in. They were able to get William Russell and Carol Ann Ford, but they got guest actors like John Gillor, I think, did William Hartnell, and Toby Hadoke did Forrester, because all the actors have passed. So you have to sit through the jarring bit of half of it is animated with different voices and half of it is original. Having watched the reconstructed Part 4, I can safely say that I never want to see it again. And when I did my Twitter pilgrimage in October of 19, I watched only the 3-part version, but it's worth a look just to see how the episode improved by cutting it in half.
I'm big on deep, like when I do sometimes I just, depending on what episode it is, and sometimes I'll put it in and watch it once and go, okay, I know what I'm going to talk about. And others like Flatline, I watched it 3 times because I really hadn't watched much. I've not watched much Modern Who during the pandemic. Just what new we've gotten new, and when me and Vic have decided to whatever one we're discussing. So I've been really just immersed in old Who. And some of them watch the whole DVD. Some of them I check out a book or review, and I'll go back and find stuff. But it all depends on because me and Vic talked about this. Is like when you do these kind of podcasts, is you can review it as neutrally as possible, but you can't take the context of the most recent time you've watched it. So me and Vic, we bring that up, and that's why she did one on, I forget what episode we did. It had nothing to do with voting, but she went on a 20-minute diatribe about why we should all vote, and I just turned my microphone off. Just went, I'm done. I let her talk for 20 minutes and just nodded a couple times and made sure she knew I was listening and she had an audience, and it's how art affects you then. When we reevaluate these things, it's always not tainted, but affected by what's happening now, how you absorb art. So.
It's really funny that you mentioned that for 2 reasons. Number one, the blog that this podcast is based on, I started writing after Donald Trump took the presidential election in 2016. So that original set of blog posts was coming from a place of rage and anguish. But the book that you volunteered to talk about today is an incredibly political bit of early 1970s Doctor Who.
Yeah, the Doctor was never political before now. Never.
Except in its very first story, the Doctor took sides between a human caveman and a Neanderthal and said, this is what you need to have as your political leader. That second episode, week 2 of An Unearthly Child, just ruined it for all time, made it political. So we are now talking about The Curse of Peladon, obviously, which is the book that set us on the road to Brexit and Boris Johnson and a whole lot of pain if you're in the UK. My condolences to my friends across the pond. So when I sent you the list of upcoming books and you volunteered for this one, I was very curious because you and in fact, this is the very first episode of Doctor Who literature that I've ever recorded with somebody in the same time zone,
Okay.
which is a novelty for me. So neither one of us grew up in the UK or have spent a significant amount of time there.
I've never been
So
there.
the common market and the EU and Brexit are second languages for us, and yet it's an incredibly political and timely story. It was when it came out in
Yeah, because
'72.
it was like, when did the union? When did they join the common? This is more a reflection of the common market. They haven't even joined the unions, not for another generation, another decade or
Right.
two.
But it's the beginning of that.
Yeah, this is the formation of the common market, and I like. I mean, I liked when Doctor Who was political. I'm a big fan of the Third Doctor, more so for stories like this. Because if you're not taking real world events and adapting them to tell your story, it's it makes it more interesting. It does. It just gives you a way to get into, because American sci-fi would make it some exaggerated thing.
Very in a very 1960s Star Trek liberal Republican over the top kind of way. Yes.
Oh yeah. That the two black on one side, white on the other. Just some of that silliness.
The TOS episode that fought the Vietnam War and said the Vietnam War is a great thing. Let's send more troops.
Yeah, with the Mugatu. Yeah, that is. I mean, I'm doing a Star Trek rewatch. I have like a Doctor Who rewatch, and I know where I'm at, and I have a Star Trek one I know where I'm at, and a Supernatural one now where I know where I'm at, so I can jump in between them. And I decided about 2 months ago, it's like I've been stuck in TOS mid-season 2 for like 4 years. I'm just gonna muscle through, and then I got through the rest of season 2, and then I put in Spock's brain and went, "No, I'm done. I'm out. I'll try this in another month or two."
What I would recommend doing, Doctor Who and Twilight Zone overlapped for 1 year, and for 1 year they were both airing at roughly the same time. If you watch the 2 parts of Edge of Destruction, and then you watch the 2 Twilight Zone episodes that aired across on those same weeks, the 2 episodes are eerie parallels of one another.
Really?
Now, these shows were made in a vacuum. Rod Serling would never have heard of Doctor Who, wouldn't have been aware that what he was writing was going out across Edge of Destruction. But the parallels are uncanny, and I encourage you to watch it in that context next time you do Edge of Destruction.
Okay, because I like that one. That's one I've pulled off the shelf just to watch it. Like, I got an hour to kill. I want to watch a Doctor Who. I do that. I've done that more recently with like other Doctors. I pulled out Web Planet because I thought it was good. I brought it. I had done it. Pulled it off to watch it, and then me and Fraser and Simon did the episode about strange stories, and I went, "Oh hell, we're gonna do my favorite strange story, which is Web Planet." So
doesn't get much stranger than that.
No, man. I still whenever I talk to our English friends, it's like when I mention the John Belushi in a bee costume, they have no idea what I'm talking about. So it's an important thing for my cultural development as a child. I discovered illicit substances and Saturday Night Live at about the right time, and Joe Cocker in a bee suit. So,
and then later on, SNL made a couple of Doctor Who references.
Oh, really? I haven't watched that in 25 years. So.
There was an episode where Paris Hilton was running a erotic phone line, and for sci-fi nerds, and she dressed up in a Tom Baker costume.
Okay.
It's one of the weirdest things. Very funny.
Yes, that sounds hysterical. I might have to Google that.
I'm quite positive she had no idea what she was doing.
No, they're just, here's your cue card, honey. Read it, please.
Put on this scarf. 10 people at home will get it, and they'll think it's very funny.
Mm-hmm.
So, what caused you to volunteer for Curse of Peladon, of all stories, and what's your personal experience with the TV episodes and then the book?
I'm a fan of this one. big fan of this Peladon story. I like this one. I think it is. There is something about the Pertwee era where he's not my favorite Doctor, but I do enjoy this era. I think it's well made. Even the stories I dislike, I understand that there's effort and craft put into them. I'm a huge fan of Letts and Dix as showrunners. I do think I'd put them up there with Davies and Lambert in how the consistency of their shows. For those 5 years, that show is consistently well made. This is a really good script. It takes a villain, the Ice Warriors, and makes them not villains, which is a great idea. Because the monsters being a monsters is like one thing I like about New Doctor Who, that he doesn't refer to them as monsters. And he stops others from doing it. They're not monsters. They're just another species. And I like it. And it's BBC does these kind of court drama shows like we do courtroom dramas in this country. They know how to do it. They know how, and they have all these great Shakespearean actors. And I mean, on this one, I read the book, I listened to David Troughton read the book, and I watched the episodes. And I got a chance to listen to Jeff and Joe talk about it because he had just dropped this story. I haven't listened to the fourth episode. I'm catching up on some comic book podcasts. So I'm holding that one for like this weekend when I take the dog for a walk. I listen to Joe and Jeff talk about part 4 of Curse of Peladon. I like this story. I think there's no fluff. There's some repetitive through the corridors for the action, but that's just, you got to have action in each episode. It's just it's a structural problem in these 4-part, in the serialized format, that you have to have some action in every act.
And it's a function of the show. It's not a fault unique to Curse of Peladon, and
it's why I think 6-parters are rough, and why I think the perfect length of a Doctor Who story, me and Jeff have kind of agreed this, it is 3 parts. That episode 3 is always fixing problems and exposition. Whoops, so we screwed this up in episodes 1 and 2. If we're going to get to our ending at the end of 4, we got to do this or do that. Because I think some of the 3-parters in the McCoy era are great.
Sometimes they're cut a little too tight, like Ghostlight. They could use some expansion, but I had this phrase going when I was doing my pilgrimage: part 3 is going to part 3, because you see it over and over again if you watch enough part 3s in succession.
I'm only watching, and I never watched these as serialized. The only serialized ones I ever saw the first time were when Time Life had the U.S. licensing, and they only had Baker's first 4 seasons.
With the Howard De Silva narrations.
Yes. Ben Franklin, or the villain from the Kentuckian. That's the only thing anybody else would know him as. He's a good Ben Franklin. But yeah, that's it. I mean, honestly, the first serialized Doctor Who that I have ever seen go out live is Flux.
Yes, I heard you mention that on the
Gallifrey never,
Most
because
Wanted.
I only had omnibuses. These are movies, and the part 3 in the movies is really hard. And you said you watched the Howard, I guess it was the Maryland MPT when you were in college. Some of them are edited like a train wreck. Some of this one works in its omnibus because it's a tight script. But like War Games, they would reshoot the same scene differently at the beginning episodes in some of the black and whites, and they would put War Games has a couple of those where you're like, wait a minute, they just did this.
Yeah, and you can't figure out where the cliffhanger is. And then with Underworld, the cliffhanger to that, they botched the edit for MPT, or wherever they got the edit from.
Now that was Lionheart. I think Lionheart was the company that was butchering them.
You can hear about a second and a half of the Howard De Silva narration in the middle of the cliffhanger. That's it. Just totally random.
Because they took the time. They had the Time Life prints. Time Life had to turn the prints over to the new company, and they were allowed to edit them. It's just I had the promotional packet. I sold it on eBay a couple of years ago, but I had the promotional packet for all those packages from Time Life through Lionheart.
See, I was talking about this with John Blum when I had him on the show last week because he's from DC. He got his Doctor Who from WETA, I think, and then from MPT,
Yeah.
and he only got to watch the omnibuses on Long Island, Channel 21. They were showing them all in one go on Saturday night, but they were showing it episode by episode. So there'd be an episode, a promotional break, episode 2, promotional break, episode 3. So I was able to watch them as serials, even though it was strung together all in one night. So what appealed about Curse of Peladon to me is I came to PBS through my mother because my mother was and still is a complete unreconstructed masterpiece theater / mystery fan.
Same here. That's what we watched on Sundays because that's what Mom watched. And when
she
I
would
grew
walk
up,
by the room when I'm watching Doctor, and she would say, "That actor was on Upstairs, Downstairs. She was on this. He was on that." And she recognized everybody.
my mom had a crush on Peter Davison, which made being a Peter Davison fan uncomfortable at times because she called him my Trissy because she loved him from All Creatures Great and Small. And she's like, he's yummy. It's like, okay, Mom, thank you. I'm gonna be ill now.
It's funny you mentioned that because I didn't know there was a new version of All Creatures until my mom brought it up the other night, and she was talking about the new Tristan versus the old Tristan.
Oh, really? Yeah, that's great.
Oh, yeah, Tristan was Doctor Who. I know Tristan very well. You've seen him on all my book covers. But Curse of Peladon is as masterpiece theater, or it's as masterpiece theater as Doctor Who ever gets,
Oh,
because it's
yeah.
the young king coming into his inheritance.
Oh yeah, it's Ivanhoe. I have a brother who loves those kind of knights in shining armor movies. I've seen the BBC, and they showed it on A&E. A&E had a version of Ivanhoe on TV, and it was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful, and it handled the Rebecca part, the anti-Semitism part of that story, very well. And I think a Troughton is in it. A Troughton is in it. It may have been Patrick, if I remember right. But I love those things, and that's what this is. The royal court, that fantasy level. I think they get this kind of court intrigue. It's better in this than in the Crusade, where they're doing real people, real historical figures. They're not doing an historically accurate story, but
right, that's more overtly Shakespeare, iambic pentameter, very flowery. Whereas this is just down in the trenches, very gritty.
Yeah, there are times, and it's very romantic. It's a romanticized version of knights and kings and queens and court intrigue. How but thinly veiled, representing something that was happening in the world at that time. Which BBC does well. BBC is this gold standard for storytelling, I think, in television, because a lot of time it's about the story, and more so than in American TV. We're a little flashier.
Right.
Yeah, a little less substance, more and bigger on structure than substance sometimes. How are things, because we have our own tropes and our own crutches. But I like this one, and this was one I've always liked. I'm equally not a fan of the second Paladin story, because one, it's a 6-parter, and it's basically this story again.
I will defend Monster of Peladon to a degree because of the dogleg that it takes at the end of part 4, where it kills off its main antagonist.
And gives you new
and then it takes someone you believe is a good guy and turns him into the antagonist for episodes 5 and 6, Eckersley.
Yeah, it's the problem with the 6-parter is you really are filling 2.5 episodes of stuff that's not needed. Genesis of the Daleks, it's one of the greatest Doctor Who stories of all time, but you don't need all that journeying through those tunnels. And the clan, you have to create peril for Harry in the middle. It's awful, and it's like, this is because you have an episode too much of time. Just cut this, So, but this one didn't have it.
They used to say they would do 6-parters because they couldn't afford enough 4-parters. They didn't have the budget to do 7 different 4-part serials a year.
And that's another script, because they're paying someone the same amount of money for a 6-parter, I'm assuming, for a 4-parter.
And with Peladon, you could reuse the costumes and reuse the monsters, so that saves your budget right there. You're not creating, with the exception of Vega Nexus, who's in 2 scenes, you're just using old costumes that you've already seen before. Alpha Centauri is back, Ice Warrior is back. It's very budget conscious.
Oh yeah, and and Letts and Dix, they're looking at depreciation scores. and seeing that, oh, Peladon scored very well. Because you're not going to get the ratings in time. Dix is already trying to get the next season done. They're looking at quick numbers. This one worked. We can save, like you said, we can save the sets. We can do this. So get Hulk to write another one and make it a 6-parter.
And they're both going home at night during season 11 and working on their novelizations. Dix is rewriting Monster of Peladon in the office by day, and then he's going home and writing Day of the Daleks at night. Barry Litz is producing by day, 2 stories at once, Planet of the Spiders and Robot, and then going home to write Doctor Who and the Demons. So those guys were burning the candle at both ends, but they were making magic on both ends of the candle.
No, it is. It's a great era, and I think some of the best novelizations are these Third Doctors, and these were the novelizations were the first real my intake on Troughton. Not on Troughton, on Pertwee, because I didn't see Pertwee and them until after I went to college. So I got these and I read them. I kept one in my bag when I went to class and in between classes or breaks when I wanted to kind of decompress from being, 19 and in college and, and I'm going to go sit in the park, and I went to an urban university. I went to the park, and, it was the early 80s and, smoked an herbal remedy in the park and read a Doctor Who novel, And I loved them. They're great. They're like little pulps. And I think it's of the wilderness years. And I think the only thing as important, and I said this in our thing up in the wilderness years on my show, was that the only thing as important as the series itself is the not Target novels. Because for English fans, as I like to rub in Jeff's noses, shit's been on TV constantly my entire life. I could, I've always been able to watch since the 1980s, watch everything when I want it on demand, or it's on. Because they're not, the old show's not is not on PBS anymore. They've pulled it all. They pulled it all about. I know PBS in Maryland got the first 2 seasons of Modern Who.
Right, they did.
And then they got nothing. They just pulled it because BBC was like, we'll find another outlet. I have Pluto on my phone. I have watched a Doctor Who episode during my lunch break. Just randomly.
I have the entire classic run on DVD, or thanks to Daily Motion, I have all of the loose canon. So I can watch Doctor Who whenever I want. But that's a very good point, because we were spoiled. Growing up on Long Island, I had access to 6 PBS stations that were showing Doctor Who at various points. I had Boston, Long Island, New York City, New Jersey, Scranton, Pennsylvania, etc. I could watch Doctor Who catalog every night of the week and a different doctor on a different PBS station. And in the UK, all you had was the books. And yet I was getting the books at the same time, 2 books every other week as a reward for babysitting my kid sister in lieu of cash. The books were literally my salary. And that's why this is the Doctor Who Literature podcast, because the books imprinted upon me as much as the TV series.
Yeah. They were very important to me, and I'm selling all my novels, but I'm not selling my Target novels. I'm going to hold on to them, and then maybe when finances are a little better, go and try to fill the holes. I've got everything else digitally. I've never done a New Adventures run. I still have not finished the first one. I find it painful. It's rough. I want to read some of the ones that people say are good, but I read the EDAs during the wilderness years when we didn't have Doctor Who, because I didn't have a TV for about 2 years in my apartment. So my Doctor Who was, you got 2 books a month. You got an 8th Doctor and a Past Doctor, and they were really good. I enjoyed them. And I was at the perfect age for those because they were they were geared to 20-year-olds, who thought it was very self-important.
My first year of law school, when I had no television, I had 1 new adventure and 1 missing adventure every month. And that was the peak of the NAs, because I was getting, Human Nature, Original Sin, the books that are considered the pinnacle of the range. And then the MAs were having a rough time with Lords of the Storm and
they had some rough ones. They have some rough ones. Man in the Velvet Mask, which is
that was rough. But then you had Empire of Glass, which was one of my favorite Hartnell books
Venusian
of all
Lullaby.
time, so.
I will defend Venusian Lullaby. That's the Web Planet of Doctor Who novels. because they got to do whatever they want. And that's what the good thing about some of them was. One of the past Doctor ones that I really liked was called Salvation. It's a first Doctor, Dodo, and Steven in 1966 New York and an alien invasion.
My review of that on the ratings guide just takes apart all the temporal and geographical errors made with regard to New York City. I need to read that again with an open mind because I was spending too much time cataloging all the mistakes that the author made in getting New York City in terms of the names of the people and the accents and the geography. I got to try that again with an open mind.
Yeah, what I liked was it was kind of like the War Machines, but in New York, and I got what they were doing, and I love Steven, and I'm a big Steven fan, so I liked the novels that he was in. And Dodo, you can do whatever you want because she was never written the same way twice.
That's right.
So,
I was the guy who ran the Steven Taylor webpage in the 1990s, so I too am a huge Steven fan.
Yeah. But on this, for preparing for this interview, I watched and listened to one. I found the book. Well, for a Target novel, it's very flowery. It's a little overwritten.
A little bit
overwritten. But when David Troughton reads it, it works. So when you said that before we were talking, you made a little comment about it being a little overwritten, because it's written to be spoken. This is a guy who writes screenplays, and you can tell it because there's no structural changes to the story. You just have a storyteller. You have a very good storyteller too. David Troughton is incredibly good.
Yes.
It is a good performance, but it is definitely, yes, you're a screenwriter who's now writing prose. They're not the same skill set.
Did you notice, I'm curious, all the extra scenes that Hayles puts into the book that were not on television, where dialogue goes on for longer and scenes go on for longer, and new scenes
and
that were never on
that
TV
because
in the first place?
It gave you some work I got to know Hepesh better.
Right.
You get to know Gran better. The scenes between Joe and Peladon I think they're more fleshed out. And he does a very good job doing Katie and him having that conversation. I would like to hear them, kind of her have like co-read the book, because I think they could have done those scenes, because I buy that in the story. Rewatching it too is like they're really good together. It's TV romance, so it's done at hyper speed. I think the way it sounded, more so when I listened to Troughton do it, those scenes had more depth. And I think some of it is, I think most of it's him taking, which is, he's reading, it's really a script. It's very, that's why there's more dialogue, because he's a screenwriter. He's putting in the stuff that he would have put in if he had time. The good stuff.
It is very atmospheric, and he names the mountain, which I believe was never given on TV, but he names the mountain, which shows up then, I believe, in the Monster of Peladon. So some of the stuff he adds here contributes to the lore.
Oh, yeah. And I think that does, and, a lot of, I have the chronology books, which I love. It's now it's so much, it's 3 volumes from the Mad Norwegian, and all these references connect, and you can tell in books and in episodes. There have been references to Target stuff in episodes of Modern Who from some of these writers. There has to have been, because these are so important.
There's one NA called Legacy by Gary Russell, Russell's first book of many, and that is part 3 of the Peladon trilogy.
I think that one is not sold. Maybe I'll give that a read, because I've got like boxes with the ones that have not sold, and I'm a follower of mine who follows Gallifrey and Let's Team Up, the comic book podcast I do.
Yes.
He got me this 2 Chronicle magazines, the second 2, the 83 and something or other. They're Panini magazines, and I've not seen them here in this country.
I ordered one through eBay, the 65 one.
Yeah,
I'm waiting on the 83 one next.
I paid way too much for it. I paid way too much.
They're worth it though. They're very good magazines.
Yeah, but I traded him 2 of my 8th Doctor novels for the 70 something in the 80s one. So
Legacy is not the best of the NAs. It's uneven, goes
it's
on
pretty
a little
thick
too
too.
long.
It's one of the
Yeah,
fat ones.
and there's a clear uneasy join between the continuity of references and the cartoonish violence. You can see where this book could have withstood better editing and the loss of about 50 pages. But as a continuation of the Peladon saga and seeing some of these characters again and bringing the Peladon trilogy to its logical end, which plays out very differently now in 2022 than it would in 1994 when the book came out, it is an interesting addition. So if you like this, it is a sequel to the novelization more than it is a sequel to the TV story. So I give it a read before you sell it.
All right, that sounds good. That sounds well. Me and Vic, when we run out of McCoy, we're gonna do the NAs. That's our plan for him, and I think it's the best plan for him because that was Doctor Who for a little bit. We're gonna like we're doing with Paul McGann. Once we finished with him with the TV movie, we went straight into Charlie and Big Finish,
Right.
which is fine because it means I got to listen. There are very few Paul McGann Big Finish that I've never been disappointed. There's some I like less than others. You know.
See, you and I are about 5 or 10 years apart, and the NAs started coming out when I was in college, my first semester of college, and that's how I
What
discovered
year did
them.
they
So
start?
91.
91. Oh God, I was been in the workforce for 5 years.
So and then I discovered Recart's Doctor Who in early 1992, where the NAs were the big topic of conversation. So for me, the NAs were my entry into fandom. Then I did the big 2.5 hour documentary on the first 4 NAs for Trap One. I'm doing pre-production on part 2 now, covering the 92 and the 93 books. So for me, the NAs were Doctor Who, and I have huge
And
emotional
that's the way
investment
I
in
am
them.
with the EDAs.
Right.
You know, it was I was at a part of my time in my life where I couldn't afford comics. I couldn't afford. My brother was getting a buddy of mine was getting me my Doctor Who magazines. I had to be do the VHS and tape and but it was a golden era for TV for me as a nerd because I had at Next Gen, I had Deep Space Nine, I had Babylon 5, I had the type of the other touchstone stuff that I liked. But the EDAs was a time when I didn't have TV, so I couldn't. That was the beginning of Doctor Who moving in to being my number one fandom. And not
Right.
until I started this podcast have I been a member of fandom in that way, like that. I don't have. I'm jealous of English fans who can go, on a day trip and see each other and do one of their small cons. We have 3 big cons in this country. What? Long Island, Chicago, TARDIS,
Right.
and Galley. And I haven't been to any of them.
I am a regular at LI Who because it's only a 60-mile drive from me in Brooklyn, and then Galley I'm at almost every year. Chicago, I was at the predecessor to Chicago TARDIS Visions in the late '90s a couple of times. I've never been to the actual Chicago TARDIS because getting away for Thanksgiving weekend is a huge ask, and I just can't do it.
Yeah, I'm hoping to finally get to Galley, but it probably won't be for a few years. It's just, with COVID and stuff like that. And I'm really disappointed because, I'm friends with, I'm acquaintance of some people that are in the show. I've been in Big Finish and,
Right.
I could have seen you. There was a couple other people I knew were going to be there. But we can't afford it because of COVID finances, and I'm not getting an airplane. Vic said to this. Me and my partner Vic was saying before we started recording our latest episode, if I see someone losing their mind, screaming crazy stuff, no mask on in an airport, I'm going toward them at very rapid speed and getting between who they're ever being abusive to, and channeling my father from Brooklyn. Basically do what we call pulling a Hugh. Is there a reason you're acting like a rude piece of shit?
When you say Brooklyn, you speak in my
It's
language.
like if your mother didn't teach you manners, I'll be glad to commence with a lesson right now. And Vic's like, you would lose it. I said, I'd get arrested. I would lose it. And I'm just not prepared for that craziness. I work in a hospital. It's, we got about 3-4 more weeks of of this, and I'll reevaluate. But people are. I walked out yesterday. We had lobby day outside my building because my office is right next to the state capitol, and
Right.
I could see that something had changed because there are all these people not wearing masks.
Your new governor, in his finite wisdom, has eliminated mask mandates,
Yeah, I
vaccine
think he doesn't
mandates.
realize that he doesn't have the authority to make them do squat. They are not state employees. He cannot order it.
Let's go back to the British politics of this. This was meant to be a topical story with the entry into the common market.
Yeah.
And when I was watching this as a kid on Long Island in 1985, that would have sailed directly over my head, rather than understanding it on a surface masterpiece theater, young king struggling to reject tradition and forge his own path. I didn't realize how overtly political the story was. And what's brilliant about the script is that it gives a defined political position to everybody.
It's a very neutral statement.
Right.
Yeah, because Hepesh has his reasons, and he's not judged for those reasons. He's judged for the choices he makes because of his beliefs, not for his. But his beliefs are not wrong. The fear of change is you're allowed to feel scared of change. It's a natural state of being. It's an instinctive part of human psyche. Is protection, is to be cautious. You fear of the unknown, and that's one thing. That reason I think this one works so well is that everybody is played, and they don't trick you, but they hold the motivations of the characters close to the vest until it's needed for dramatic moments. Like we're told that the Ice Warriors are villains, and they're not the villains of the piece. Ever. You keep waiting for them to become the villain of the piece. And I don't know if that was directed from Uncle Terrence, or was that in the original script?
You have to really just commend him for the work that he did, making each of these characters three-dimensional, from Arcturus to Alpha Centauri to Hepesh to Grun even, and especially to the King.
And how Pertwee sells, these are not the greatest monster designs of all time. We make fun of Alpha Centauri. Jeff brought up the thing on Hamster that they had to put a robe on Alpha Centauri because it looked like a man's genitalia with octopus arms, and but I don't know a Doctor Who fan that doesn't love Alpha Centauri. When she makes her little cameo in Empress of Mars, I fanboyed a little bit.
I had that spoiled for me on Facebook before I got to watch that in the States, and I wish it hadn't been spoiled, but it's a great moment.
It is, and I'm an unapologetic Gatiss fan. I don't care. He's writing what he would have written if he wrote for the. He kind of, when he writes an episode, he goes, "What era of Doctor Who do you want me to write?" Mm-hmm. I'll write it. I think he has a better concept of horror because he is an expert on horror. If you've never seen one of his documentaries of horror, just Google it on YouTube. They're amazing. He is well versed in the subject, and it's stuff I didn't know and very interesting. I'm not a big horror fan, but this has all those elements. I'm going to have to go back and kind of think. I like Ice Warriors, even though it's a padded 6-parter based Under Siege. It's kind of there's aspects of that one I like a great deal. I'm not a big fan of the Seeds of Doom. It's okay. It's a fun. All Troughton is fun. It's never not fun.
Ice Warriors I'll defend, because when I watched it in my pilgrimage, it was coming right after The Abominable Snowmen, and there's no story that fell further in my estimation than Abominable Snowmen. So coming to Ice Warriors after that was a relief, and the philosophical debates that are the spine of Ice Warriors, even though much of that gets deleted for the eventual novelization, the philosophical debates on TV come to life because of the particular cast that is in the Ice Warriors. So that...
I see that, yeah. And I think me and Vic, that's the next... Ice Warriors is the next Troughton we have to cover. And I'm thinking some of the science, anti-science, is going to take a new hit in our brains, because people are, starting to say they're smarter than the scientists. You know, people are pushing back against technology because we do.
I think you'll appreciate Ice Warriors a lot more now in this particular point in time.
Yeah, I find that for most of these that it's going to be. We live in interesting times right now. As somebody who remembers the late 60s, even just vaguely, and the early 70s, where this country was going through something similar to this. I'm not surprised by any of it,
Which is why Curse of Peladon is comforting, because Hepesh gets his comeuppance, and he gets to make a point and sort of have a deathbed revelation. And
yeah, it's a nice scene, and it's a nice scene in the book. It's a nice scene in the episode.
But in real life, Hepesh is winning if he hasn't won already. And you could argue that Hepesh is now in charge of the UK, although possibly not for much longer given the latest scandal. It's nice to watch a story where Hepesh loses, because in real life that is not historically the case.
Yes. It's a cabinet of Hepeshes of just blind. The old days were better. It's like you weren't even alive during the old days, and they sucked.
And they all had Hepeshy hairstyles too.
Oh my God! Just get that guy a comb. Just like a bad clown wig.
And Boris Johnson, like me, was born in New York City, but that is where the resemblance stops.
It's a I live in the South, and I live in this little bubble in Richmond. And I don't, the further out from Richmond I go, especially south, it's, it is what it is. But they're people who cling to the past. Southerners are in this country cling to the past. The way it was better. The way it was, we weren't, it wasn't better, and you have no idea what it was like. And you can't fight change. Back to the story, it's like Hepesh is trying to stop change, and the change is never given is it ever given a real value in either the book or in the show, other than that Peladon thinks it's right. He's making a leadership decision. This is what our people need. We must move forward.
Which is where I think you'll appreciate the Gary Russell book, even though I disagree with some of the politics at the end of that book. At least it is an honest evaluation of what benefits versus detriments the Federation has brought to this planet.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, at the common market, which in my viewpoint, it is a good thing. It's you want it the more open. I'm not a free market guy, but I'm an open trade guy. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally.
Free market is, to me, a buzzword for people who don't want a free market. They want to control the market. Where open market means that you can sell to, you can trade with people. It builds relationships. It cuts down on wars. It's, look, Vietnam ended. 10 years later, we're friends with them, and we're selling them Coca-Cola and DVD players.
That's right.
VHS players. And good or bad for capitalism. I'm some form of it. There may be a good form of it, but it's not the end all and be all. But it's also just being able to interact with another country, trade. Like, hey, let's trade. I'll teach you here's my food. Here's what I mean. A common exchange of ideas, economies, art, whatever.
Cultures.
Open borders is better. Because you don't get stuck in these silos, which Hepesh walks around in his own personal silo, and Peladon, and in this he's just trying to do what's right, and you see throughout the book and the show him battling with it, and it's a good. That's what I liked about it, that it is so that decision and these issues are fleshed out and are happening, even if, like you or me, when we first read it, didn't know what it was an allegory for.
Right.
And I remember, I'm old enough to remember some of that stuff on the news because my parents were big. We sat and watched the news, even the kids. And my mom, like your mom, was big on. My mom was a huge Anglophile, so she followed British politics. Oh God, you want to hear my mother cuss, mention Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher in her house? You get 45 minutes of swearing. But and this time, and watching it and just thinking about Brexit and all the bad moves, because they didn't think, because all they thought is it'll go back to the good old days, and
To quote my fellow Long Islander Billy Joel, the good old days weren't always good, and tomorrow ain't as bad as it seems.
Yeah, it's the nostalgia is a curse. Don't look back. I mean, look back at fondness of things you've done in the past, good or bad, as long as you were entertained and you didn't hurt anybody, is fine. But to just, change is scary. And I mean, the monster in this thing is change, really.
Then people forget the U.S. had open borders until 1923. All of my grandparents came here because of open borders. I am only second generation American. America benefited from our presence, not to be immodest about it. And then as soon as my last grandparent got here, Calvin Coolidge takes over, the borders close, no more of your people. And it stayed that way for another 40 plus years.
Well, had this conversation with somebody the other day about migrant workers and why we're going to have problems with food. England's having it because they don't have people coming over to. We've never had enough people to pick our food because it's seasonal work. Mm-hmm. People who do it have to travel to do it, and they're skilled at it. It is a skill they learn. The same people go and pick the same crop for the same people year after year, and up until Reagan, I think it was, that you could come in, earn your living, and then go home with the money.
Right.
And then they said, no, they're taking our money away. No. More people are buying the shit they picked than we're paying them to pick it. We're making a profit. And they're going back to their country and putting our money into their economy and doing well. Now that you don't let them come freely to come and pick our food and do the jobs that we don't want to do, they're staying. And now you're going to blame that on them. Where we had a system to where they could come and go, and it was something we traded with our neighbors. We need your labor. We're going to give them money. It's going to go back into your economy. We all do good. It's this free trade thing they talk about now. And it's like, but it can't be free if the border's closed.
Right.
You can't. They're your neighbor. They're not your enemy. So, and that's my political rant on this one. I do love the story because it is political, and I buy it. And it's not bonk bonk on the head. And I don't mind bonk bonk on the head. If you have a message in your story, don't hide your message. Polish it a bit. So I forget it's a message from time to time.
And then you have the glorious sight of all three aliens lined up, the Ice Warriors, Alpha Centauri, and Arcturus, and they're all green. And when Terrence Dick said the color for aliens is always green, he's almost certainly talking about this story. This is the origin of that.
Well, I mean, he had some weird rules. But it's also, there is a house style. Don't you think this is, in this era, isn't there a house style more so than any other time?
And this is the middle story of the Pertwee era. It was the middle story filmed in the middle season. This is literally the center of the Pertwee era. It was aired second, but it was filmed third, and season 9 was the middle of Pertwee's 5 seasons.
Wow.
It's the center point. So we have been at this for about an hour. This is a good time to start wrapping it up. So let's just go back to the book momentarily. I recorded the first half of this program before you came on board. So when you play this in chronological order, you're going to hear me talking at length about the book's word choices and how it's overdone. The point that you've made is terrific, though, that this was written as a script and it was meant to be performed rather than read silently. So I need to go back and listen now to the David Troughton audiobook of this, because that may very well change my take on the book, which I thought was overwritten and purple.
It sounds he makes it. You may listen to it and go, it's not the material, it's him. It may be David Troughton, who's wonderful at it, you know. I always like when I see him. I'm a big fan of Midnight. He's great in Midnight.
He's great as an antagonist in Midnight. Yes.
Oh my God, that's an underappreciated gem. That's great screenwriting.
Yes.
That is. I'm a big Sorkin fan and fan of Whedon's writing, not of Whedon the man.
Whedon is topical this week because my upstairs neighbor just got their copy of New York Magazine with Whedon on the cover.
The excerpts I read were in Barrett. He should be, you know, he's allowed to have his point of view and say his side, but he really does just. It's one of those people. It's like, dude, best to keep your mouth shut. You're digging.
New York Magazine is very good about letting you have your piece and hang yourself with your own rope by talking too much.
Oh my God! It's like, shut up. Your PR person not in the room with you, shaking his head, going, "What the fuck?" Yeah, it was pretty bad.
Well, Ross, thank you very much for coming on and talking about many topics, not just the Peladon book.
Sorry, I bring the Gallifrey Most Wanted trademark tangent with me.
I also have difficulty sticking to the script, so I certainly appreciate that. And I'm going to have you back on in about a little less than 2 months to discover another book, which I'll reveal when the time comes.
Cool.
And looking forward to speaking to you again. So just briefly, where can we find you on the internets and what's coming up next for your various podcast projects?
All right. Well, like you said, I have 3 podcasts. First is Gallifrey's Most Wanted. This weekend after we record this, I will post our episode about Flatline from the Peter Capaldi era. I do not know what me and Jeff's next Runcible report is because of schedules. Most likely we're going to cover animation. Which is topical because, topical right now, the Doctor Who animation. We did the first half. We did the first batch. Now we're going to do everything up, but before the final, before Abominable Snowman. And I also have just recently started a new podcast by myself called Stop, Let's Team Up, about the history and the variety of the superhero team books, which is the comic books that I was a big fan of. I'm not on a good schedule yet because I record by myself, and it is incredibly difficult to do a podcast of one. I feel like I'm a televangelist trying to be overly positive. I recorded an episode Sunday, and I am junking it because when I listened to it while I was editing it, I went, "This is crap." So I'm doing about one every 2 weeks, and hopefully we'll get to bi-weekly with it, with guests and jumping around through all the history of comics and the super team genre, and stuff like that. We'll have an upcoming episode on inclusion, that representation matters, and an old white guy is going to talk to someone a lot smarter and a little younger, and we're going to talk about why representation really, really matters, especially nowadays in art.
I am very excited to hear that, and I'll see you back on this show in a few weeks. And until you come back, I look forward to seeing you somewhere in time or space.
Thank you.
Once again, my thanks to Ross from the Gallifrey's Most Wanted and spin-off podcasts to join me in talking about Doctor Who and the Curse of Peladon and the novelization. My copy of the book is the 1984 Target reprint as distributed in the USA by Lyle Stewart Incorporated from Secaucus, New Jersey. This was one of the last books to be released without a UPC or barcode on the back, although it does have the price that the Target books cost when I first started getting them, $2.95 US. It is numbered 13 in the Target library, That's actually pretty close to the publication order. It was the 11th Target book, but the numbering scheme on the spine of the books was alphabetical order for the first 70 or so books, and then after that, the numbers corresponded to release order instead. Unusual for the mid-1980s Target releases, this retains the original Chris Chapman cover artwork. The logo has been replaced with the 1970s design logo in brown, outlined in white and black, and the spine is brown with the title in white and the author's name in yellow, and the line number 13, lucky number 13, in black. It does still have interior illustrations by Alan Willow, although Chris Chapman is not credited as the cover painting artist in the 1984 reprint. The book is in microscopic print, which is not a problem for me when I was 11, but certainly is a problem now at age 48 as my bifocals are starting to outlive their usefulness. The book is 136 pages, which is on the shorter end of the Target line to date, but the books are soon to get much shorter than that. There's only one page of other available Doctor Who titles at the back, Doctor Who and the Abominable Snowmen, up through Doctor Who and the Demons. If you were interested in buying a Target book from later in the alphabet, you were not in luck if this was your only way of looking at upcoming Doctor Who titles. I did write in the cliffhanger spaces. I even wrote Episode 1 on page 7, which is the first page of the book. This was the point late in my childhood when I was writing the episode titles as they appeared on screen, rather than just using a numeral 1, 2, 3, or 4. If the story said Episode 1, I would write Episode 1 in the book. If it said Episode numeral 7, as in the Troughton years, I would write Episode numeral 7. And for the Ice Warriors, I would just write 2, 3, or 4 in all capital letters. That is probably one of the more embarrassing things that I can tell you about my collection of the Target novelizations. The book is in remarkably good shape, without too many dents or scratches or creases. Because I was probably 12 or 13 when I first got this, the prose style was a little much for me, and it didn't read or flow as smoothly as the Terrance Dicks books did when I was that age. So even though the book is 35 years old and it's been read several times, you probably wouldn't know that just by looking at my copy. Next time, right on the heels of the introduction to the Ice Warriors, we're going to get our very first Cyberman novel, which, as with Curse of Peladon, is not actually a novelization of their first TV adventure. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. I'm Jason, your host and editor and producer. Special thanks to my special guest, Ross, from Gallifrey's Most Wanted. This podcast is brought to you by Anchor and can also be found on Spotify and Google Podcasts. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and you can also find me on the Trap One podcast from time to time. I write about Doctor Who on Twitter using the hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage, that's Dr. Who Pilgrimage. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, suggestions. Next time, we'll be discussing Doctor Who and the Cybermen from early 1975, and again we'll be joined by a very special guest. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.